everyone. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Rebecca Jolly, and I'm a museum associate in curatorial research at the Wingate Museum of Art. I'm really excited to welcome you all to this evening's program, which is a lecture by Dr. RachelEppBuller. The event is held in conjunction with one of our current exhibitions entitled No Man's Land, A Feminist Reimagining. You can find more information about the exhibition online at wingatemuseum.org, and you can also make a reservation to see the show in person. And while we're hosting this evening's program virtually, we want to take time to acknowledge that the Wingate Museum of Art at Hendrix College occupies the traditional homelands of the Osage, Quapaw, and Caddo. So we offer our respect and gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have cared for the land over generations. So now I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for tonight. RachelEppBuller is a visual artist, an art historian, an educator, and a mother of three. Her artistic, scholarly, and curatorial work addresses these intersections, focusing on the maternal body and feminist care in contemporary art contexts. She has exhibited her work in solo and group exhibitions in the US and Europe. Her books include Reconciling Art and Mothering and Inappropriate Bodies, Art Design and Maternity, edited with Charles Reeve. Her new research creation project is tentatively titled Slow Practices for Speculative Futures, Embodied Listening Through Contemporary Art. She's a Fulbright Scholar, a board member of the National Women's Caucus for Art, a regional coordinator of the Feminist Art Project, and professor of visual arts and design at Bethel College in Kansas. So one more time, thanks to you, Rachel, for being here, and I'm so excited to hear what you have to say tonight. And with that, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thanks for the invitation tonight. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here this evening to talk with you about some of my scholarship, and I have to also thank Mary Kennedy for this wonderful invitation. I've never been to Arkansas, and I was really looking forward to coming last March before everything shut down. But, you know, as humans, we're adaptable creatures. So after a year of navigating Zoom and Moodle and Teams with my students and in virtual conferences, mostly I'm just pretty grateful for the ways that we can still connect across distance in spite of everything. So thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so we can look at some images while I talk. So hopefully you can see that. All right. So for the past decade, much of my art and writing has been devoted to intersections of art and the maternal in a broad sense. So in the interest of full disclosure, I'll say that for me, this was also a way of merging personal and professional interests. After embarking on the journey of motherhood myself, I became more aware, maybe naturally, of the ways in which mothers are represented and aren't represented in both art history and popular culture. I've done a great deal of research and writing on the topic, and what I'll share tonight are some examples of artistic representations of the maternal and examples of the ways in which contemporary artists intervene in museum or gallery spaces in non-traditional ways, or even bypass the museum altogether, as they seek to bring visibility to issues of mothering and use the lens of maternity to creatively imagine new ways of doing things. For both historical and contemporary artists, motherhood has proven to be a problematic source of inspiration. This is not to say that art history excludes representations of mothers. On the contrary, we find quite a bit of maternal imagery, which in Christian contexts has been dominated for centuries by that mother above all others, the Virgin Mary. And yet, as Andrea Liss has argued, the history of art primarily conveys images of patriarchal motherhood, picturing the institution of motherhood, what Liss calls the myth of the all-loving, all-forgiving, all-sacrificing mother, a prevalent and powerful myth. The Virgin Mary then set the stage for a model of submissive, chaste, and sacrificial motherhood promoted for centuries to come. Thus, art historical representations of mothers have been narrow, which in turn have contributed to a narrow cultural construction of maternity, and until recently allowed little room for artists to picture the diversities of maternal experience. So the first step for artists and art historians was simply to bring greater attention and greater visibility to maternal bodies and experiences. It might be expected that the feminist art movement of the 1970s would have opened the door to more diverse representations of motherhood, but that was not always the case. inspired in part by Betty Friedan's landmark book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. Many feminists eagerly sought to overturn gender roles and work to free women from the burden of being trapped in the home and economically dependent on a male provider. Of course, hindsight makes clear the problematic premise of Friedan's book. As Patricia Hill Collins points out, Friedan's vision was much less applicable to families outside of a white perspective, where racial oppression and economic inequity often made the concept of stay-at-home mothers unfeasible. Even so, the vision of the mother trapped in the home and dependent on a husband in many ways imposed constraints on artistic activity at the time. White feminists threw off the burdens of motherhood in culture, and many also dismissed the experiences of motherhood as basis for serious art making. Some women hid the very existence of their children from the art world, facing ambivalence at best and rejection at worst from both male and female colleagues. Artist Muriel Chernick has written of the chilly reception she received from curators visiting her studio after learning she was also the mother of twins. 20 years after that visit, when she organized an exhibition entitled Maternal Metaphors, full of really compelling work by well-known artists, she struggled to locate a venue for the show. She was turned away with excuses like the show's theme was not timely, and encountered not just disinterest, but significant hostility to the ideas she presented. I think it's an interesting contradiction that motherhood was not a readily accepted theme in feminist art of the 70s, a time when female artists were mining their own personal experiences as well as commonalities among groups of women for subject matter. And on the whole, feminist artists of the 70s had quite a bit to say about the female body, but only about certain bodies. Feminist art critic Lucy Lepard, writing in 1976, identified what she saw as a lack of extant work around motherhood, despite the renewed focus among many Western feminist artists on issues of bodily representation. She wrote, "No women dealing with their own bodies and biographies have introduced pregnancy or childbirth as a major theme. Perhaps procreativity is the next taboo to be tackled." Art on themes of mothering did exist in the 70s. They were just few and far between. A group of artists that called themselves Mother Art came together specifically in reaction to the perceived exclusion of mothers from feminist projects in California. They collaborated to produce art, organize workshops, and curate exhibitions around themes of mothering, childcare, domestic labor, and maternal representation. Most famous, of course, is Mary Kelly's influential postpartum document, a 135-part work made over the course of several years and first exhibited in 1979. The piece chronicles Kelly's relationship with her son in the extended postpartum period from his birth until he entered school at age 6. As you can see in this excerpt of images, much of Kelly's work focuses on text. Postpartum document highlights various developmental milestones, weaning from breastfeeding, learning to speak, to write, starting school. The image on the left is a photograph of writings on slate. The child's attempt at writing letters, juxtaposed with Kelly's own writings, and journal entries that range from interpretations of his development to efforts to find a good daycare. In her own thinking about the work, Kelly drew on the ideas of psychoanalysis, thinkers like Freud and Lacan, who write a good deal about the parent-child relationship. In postpartum document, we see how in some respects the mother's identity has become fused with the child's, how her existence is defined in part by his. Mary Kelly took hold of this mother-child relationship and transformed it into a vehicle for artistic expression. This was bold at the time, embracing her role as a mother when few artists even acknowledged or felt able to acknowledge that identity. And in this way, she broke new ground and provided inspiration to later artists who struggled with the same issues of personal and professional identity. In fact, many artists working today on maternal issues cite postpartum document as a major influence. So Kelly leveraged maternal experience as a source for art making, yet pointedly avoided representing her own body. The maternal body is perhaps most often thought of as the pregnant body, which gains more attention in popular culture today than it did just a few decades ago. So anyone on this call my age or older may well remember the controversy generated by Annie Leibovitz's famous photograph of a very pregnant and nude actress Demi Moore, published on the August 1991 cover of Vanity Fair. It generated heated debate at the time, although looking back, we can see that it also ushered in an era of more commonly accepted images of pregnancy in pop culture, which would be the subject of an entirely different talk, baby bumps among celebrities and royals, etc. In the history of art, we see no shortage of nude female bodies, but the pregnant nude was something entirely different, a rare representation. Alice Neel is one of the few artists from an earlier era to have tackled this subject. She painted an unprecedented series of female nudes in the 60s and 70s, and not only does she paint the pregnant nude, she also emphasizes or even exaggerates the grotesque physicality of late pregnancy. So this is the groundwork, I would say, the setting for how contemporary artists have come to engage the maternal. Oops. As we look to some more recent examples, I've divided the art into four sort of general themes: the maternal body, the maternal gaze, art that pushes maternal boundaries, which often intervenes in the gallery space in some way, and finally, artists who employ a maternal framework to consider larger systems. One of the most well-known contemporary artists to address the pregnant body is Renee Cox. During graduate school, Cox announced her pregnancy and found little support from either fellow students or professors. Like many other women, she was forced to confront the problems inherent in the dual identities of mother and artist. And she turned the experience into the Yo Mama series, a set of over life-size photographs, two of which you see here. Cox uses her own body as subject, identifying herself as mother in each image, whether pregnant or nursing or holding her child. There are a number of interesting things happening in these images. For one, because they are huge, they grant a heroic quality to the idea of motherhood. And Cox lays full claim to the pregnant nude body. This is not a body that's on display in a sexual way for a male viewer. This is a powerful body that is the source of another human life. And she's coming from a very different place than someone like Mary Kelly. As a white artist, Mary Kelly turned away from a centuries-long history of the white female nude being objectified, put on display. Part of what is powerful about Cox's work is that she's implicitly pointing out that Black bodies don't have the same history when it comes to visual representation. And if we go the route of avoiding the female body altogether, we effectively silence those women whose bodies were scarcely represented in the first place. So what Renee Cox does here in the 1990s is groundbreaking, not only giving visibility to the pregnant female nude, but also proclaiming the Black female body as an alternate and equal definition of beauty. In media culture as well as art, standards of beauty continue to privilege whiteness, so Cox's over life-sized imagery is forceful, unpredictable, unexpected, and implicitly it's imbued with a history of race that we don't necessarily recognize when it's a representation of a white body. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, contemporary artists increasingly began to explore maternal subjectivity as a place from which to speak. And of course, the maternal body is more than just the pregnant body. In 1998, South African artist Terry Kurgan spent 6 months doing an artist residency at 2 different maternity hospitals in Cape Town. The product of her research became Maternal Exposures, a large-scale installation of photographs and sound. During her research, Kurgan photographed women in the first hours and days after giving birth. In the grid format installation, you see an excerpt of it here. We see mothers of different races and classes, healthy babies, and babies struggling. The photographs are accompanied by a soundtrack, a woven narrative of fragmentary conversations and ambient sounds that she collected from maternity wards, midwife and obstetric units, prenatal clinics, and neonatal intensive care units. In this project, Kurgan tried to make visible that which is often overlooked or maybe covered up in society. Kurgan's photographs channel the roller coaster of emotions in new motherhood, some of which are directly related to the physical after effects of labor and delivery. Kurgan first put together this grid of photographs and accompanying soundtrack for an exhibition titled Bringing Up Baby, Artists Survey the Reproductive Body. But following the exhibition, hospital staff approached her about redesigning the work as a permanent installation at Mowbray Maternity Hospital in Cape Town. In its permanent form, Maternal Exposures effectively continues Kurgan's aim of blurring the boundaries of public and private. The work is installed in the prenatal waiting area, the most densely trafficked area of the hospital. In redesigning the work for the space, Kurgan took out the soundtrack but added panels of text, you can see here in the image, derived from her encounters with pregnant women and new mothers. The text alternates between Afrikaans, English, and Xhosa, the three principal languages of the Western Cape, so communicating in a variety of ways to the populations. It's one thing to feature maternal bodies in a hospital setting, maybe another entirely to do so in a museum context. Dutch artist Reineke Dijkstra's New Mothers portraits picture three young mothers in the immediate postpartum period, one photographed an hour after giving birth, another 1 day afterwards, and the third 1 week later. And these are intimate. These are no romanticized portrayals of motherhood. Instead, we see the physicality of motherhood and of the birth experience and of its physical and emotional after effects. US artist Monica Bach focuses specifically on the physicality of the birth process in a work that addresses the immediate postpartum experience. Afterbirth sac fluid cord is a set of 3 dustpans cast out of glycerin, which makes them fragile. And she uses them to commemorate a monumental but fleeting experience. Each dustpan holds a glass bottle in its handle. One carries a bit of amniotic sac, the next a bit of amniotic fluid, and the last a piece of umbilical cord. So rather than sweeping them up into a dustpan and throwing them away, Bach carefully encapsulates these usually discarded side effects. They become almost memorials to the pregnancy and birth, and in their dustpan forms maybe also speak to the caretaking that follows, to nourishment and preservation. Monica Bach's work can also transition us into a second category of work, the maternal gaze. This encompasses work by artists who use their maternal position, their children, or the parent-child relationship as inspiration or subject matter. Also titled Maternal Exposure, but now with the subtitle, Don't Forget the Lunches, Bach addresses a slightly later stage of maternal experience. As you can see here, it's a large-scale installation. The piece consists of 418 lead sheet bags embossed with school and day camp lunch menus, packed for 2 young children in the course of a single year. The black lead bags spread across the floor in the order the original lunches were prepared. Intermittently inserted, 88 small lead sheets replace lunch bags and announce sick days, snow days, and holidays, days when no lunches had to be made. Here's a detail where you can see the imprinted lunch menus on the lead bags. As fragile counterparts to the protective yet poisonous lead bags, Bach cast another 428 bags out of orange glycerin, which also accumulate on the floor. I think we can understand this piece in part as about the daily grind, the routines of daily life that have to happen, whether we enjoy them or not. But it's more than that. If we look at her title, Maternal Exposures, we see there's also a vulnerability there, that by sending her children out into the world with their packed lunches, she is daily exposing both her children and her nurturing skills to public scrutiny. Her status as a mother is being evaluated based on what is in her children's lunches. Do they contain enough fruits and vegetables? Or are they full of junk food and empty calories? Or did she forget to even pack the lunch? The contents of the lunches then, healthy or unhealthy, set her up as either a good mother or a bad mother. And she echoes this dichotomy by juxtaposing the poisonous lead bags with the glycerin bags, whose connection to soap immediately sets up a clean and healthy connotation. Photographer Gail Rebhan looks at her own perceptions of societal judgment related to mothers. As the parent of a son in his early 20s, she made a series of photos in his bedroom when he was home from college one summer. Part of the work was intended to document US disposable society and mass consumption, but it also raised larger issues about her parenting, boundaries of privacy, for one thing. She told her son only after the fact that she had made these photographs, not wanting him to be self-conscious or to clean up his room before she could photograph it, although she did admit that this was an unlikely possibility. She acknowledges that this raises issues of privacy and voyeurism. Is there an age at which it is no longer acceptable for a parent to enter a child's room without permission? Has she crossed a line in not only entering her son's room, but also presenting his private space to the public? Rebhan also acknowledges that the actions of her child reflect on her as a parent, that as in Monica Bach's Don't Forget the Lunches, there may be some value judgment placed on her as a mother. Rebhan says, "Part of me feels that this work portrays me as a neglectful mother. Am I terrible for allowing my son to keep a messy room or for allowing him to drink alcohol and eat unhealthy food? Would I be a better mother if I made my son clean up? Do I allow this behavior because I can use it to make art? Should I be too ashamed or embarrassed to exhibit this work?" Carrie Mae Weems, too, makes clear that the maternal position offers a framework that extends well beyond pregnancy and the postpartum period. Her kitchen table series uses this intimate, domestic space as a kind of stage set to speak to the main character's multiple identities as woman, mother, lover, friend, identities that coexist but not always without tension. Some of the photographs consider the relationship between mother and growing daughter, the conversations, the role modeling, the sometimes difficult emotions bound up in family ties and shifting relationships as children age. I would be remiss if I did not also include some of the more difficult work that comes from the place of the maternal gaze. For struggle, grief, and loss are also parts of the experience for many people. Melissa Gwynn's paintings, All My Fabergés, are a series of paintings thinking about assisted reproductive technologies, ART, considering the blockbuster shows of Fabergé eggs as precious, highly valuable objects, and the ways in which this parallels many women's experiences when it comes to harvesting their own eggs, either to extend the biological clock or to combat infertility. Or German artist Fred Hüning's haunting and difficult photographs taken with his wife. Hüning's trilogy of photo books, Eine, Zwei und Drei, portrays the trauma of their loss of a child to stillbirth, as well as the trepidation and then joy that accompany a second pregnancy and birth. The photographs become a cathartic tool for dealing with grief and reveal the intensity of birth and death within family cycles. Meryl Crable's work has explored the difficult emotions that accompany the journey toward parenthood, as he and his first wife suffered several miscarriages. Sorrow and fear live alongside our awareness of the miracle of birth. And Crable says, it isn't so much shocking that pregnancies end early as it is that they sometimes result in new life. In a later series, Inquiry into Gifts, Crable explored his family's experience of awaiting the birth of a daughter whom they knew would be born with Down syndrome, as well as her development in the extended postpartum period. Throughout the series, he touches on parental and societal expectations, considerations of, quote, normalcy, and the fear and pain that accompany the wonder of parenthood. A third thematic grouping of work might be considered as pushing maternal boundaries. Much like the first two groupings, artists approach this in a variety of ways, expanding boundaries of behavior, ideas, or expectations. a number of artists engage with the difficult emotions that can be considered with the birth of a child. Fiber artist Carla Tillman created a series of jacquard weavings during her pregnancy that spoke to her conflicting emotions, excitement, but also great fear of the unknown, as well as fear of impending postpartum depression. In Art Marks, Kate Kretz explored a common postpartum phenomenon, the temporary submergence of the mother's identity apart from the child. Kretz had worked for 15 years as a professional artist, so the birth of her child caused a major shift in her work-life balance. She said, "At the end of each day, if I have not been able to get into the studio, I prick my finger and write the word art before going to bed. Appeases the art gods, tells them I am still here, have not abandoned those who have been so good to me and saved my life. I mark the day, I make something." Photographer Catherine Opie has pushed against cultural expectations of maternal identity, or who we expect a mother to be, in a variety of ways, using her photographs to make visible lesbian communities in Los Angeles and around the US. A big part of all of her work has to do with the idea of community, how to find community, how to create community. In 1998, she made the Domestic series, portraits of lesbian couples and families photographed within their households. She traveled around the US to, as she put it, document the lesbian dream, parallel or maybe counter to the idea of the American dream. When she herself entered a domestic partnership and had children, she made a series of photographs related to her own family, including self-portrait nursing that you see here. We can see from the way that she's positioned that there's a clear Madonna and child reference, and yet there are other elements that function more subversively. She's a large woman with hefty arms and large breasts, not at all the petite, graceful Madonna of art history. Her hair is short, her face has a ruddy complexion, again pushing back against definitions of beauty. One piece of the larger context for this photograph that any art historians here may be familiar with are her earlier self-portraits that deal with self-mutilation and sadomasochism. In the nursing self-portrait then, she occupies a much more expected heteronormative position. But the child in her lap too confronts our cultural expectations. He's not an infant. He's closer to a toddler, maybe 2 years old, with arms and legs that extend well beyond her lap. For US culture, the notion of extended breastfeeding very much pushes back against boundaries of propriety. You may recall in 2012, a story about extended breastfeeding on the cover of Time magazine caused a huge uproar because of the cover photo primarily, which shows a mother nursing her 3-year-old. Jamie Lynn Grummett is the mother pictured here. And when I spoke with her once, she shared that the photographer intentionally positioned them in this very provocative way. The standing position makes the child seem even older than he is and makes the nursing seem more uncomfortable and more unconventional. Readers of the magazine then wrote in with outrageous accusations that the mother was harming the child for life by continuing to nurse past infancy. And we see that the magazine's words too on the cover position this mother as extreme. In 2004, Canadian artist Jess Dobkin staged the Lactation Station breast milk bar in a Toronto art gallery. During the evening, Dobkin took on the role of sommelier, like at a wine tasting. Only in this case, she invited visitors to a tasting of pasteurized samples of human breast milk donated by 6 local nursing mothers. The milk didn't come from the artist herself, although she photoshopped herself here for the promotional photograph for the event. The performance, of course, pushes cultural taboos and comfort levels of the participating audience surrounding issues of breastfeeding. Throughout the course of the evening, the artist engaged visitors in a dialogue about breastfeeding as she discussed the taste complexities of each milk sample. Participants talked about how each milk they tasted had its own flavor, tasted different. And the milk donors were there to discuss how their diets might have affected the flavor of their milk. And they talked very openly about their discomfort that we are so used to drinking milk from other species, cows or even goats, but that milk from our own species feels far too intimate. And maybe the most radical example, in 2011, Brooklyn artist Marty Kotak intervened in the gallery space, giving visibility to motherhood like never before by creating a durational performance entitled The Birth of Baby X. Prior to her baby's arrival, Kotak designed a home birth installation complete with a birthing pool and birthing balls at the Microscope Gallery, as you see here. She lived in the gallery until she gave birth to her son, Ajax, in that space. For the remainder of the exhibition, the gallery continued to show a video of the birth. Kotak not only transformed the gallery into a domestic space, but gave major visibility to the act of birth, an act that is highly intimate and highly private. And while we now see many images of pregnancy in popular culture, the actual event of childbirth is almost entirely unseen. Kotak pushes us to rethink that lack of representation, and she intervenes in the gallery space at the same time. You might think of white-walled art galleries full of precious objects that are not entirely in line with bringing a place to bring children. Indeed, might feel hostile to that idea. And I think many museums now reach out specifically to young families, but Kotak's intervention in a commercial gallery is an explicit and really provocative bringing together of the personal and professional. There are so many examples that I could show. Suffice it to say that in the first decades of the 2000s, when I was a new mother myself, this is the kind of work that I was seeking in my field. Artists who drew attention to many and varied maternal contexts, and I was looking for the art historians who were writing about them. But there was a dearth of writing until Andrea Liss published Feminist Art and the Maternal in 2009, a groundbreaking text that put the maternal body center stage. Shortly after, Muriel Chernick and Jenny Klein's anthology, The M Word, Real Mothers in Contemporary Art, brought together key second wave feminist artists and thinkers with contemporary voices and provided some much needed historical context for a newly emerging subfield. And at the same time, I was working on what became my first book, Reconciling Art and Mothering, published the book you want to read after all. The book was an edited collection of essays. Half were scholarly essays written by art historians, and half were art-based narratives written by visual artists about their own work and experiences. I'm really proud that our lineup included artists and historians from 6 continents whose work has been widely cited in the years since. But looking back on this book, I can see how the field has shifted in some ways close to a decade on. Reconciling Art and Mothering came from that place of needing to locate mothers and maternal experiences in art and art history, to find their voices, to recognize them, to normalize their representation, to figure out how they integrated and managed these two often competing roles of mother and artist. But part of what I've noticed in the years since is that so much of the conversation a decade ago and earlier had to do with fitting into existing systems. And increasingly, artists are rejecting the neoliberal idea that the individual must strive to achieve her own form of balance by fitting into an existing structure. And instead, they're advocating for collective and creative strategies to re-envision systems that might make a true work-life balance achievable, that there's a different way to make it work, so to speak. And that's one of the themes that in a volume that I published last year with my colleague Charles Reeve on inappropriate bodies, art, design, and maternity. In the interviews, essays, and conversations, these are a couple of questions that many artists have been engaging with in recent years. What are the structures and institutional systems that act as barriers for artist parents? And how can we create systems differently, design systems differently, rather than asking artist mothers and artist parents to fit themselves into structures that may be inherently exclusive? There are still plenty of artists working to make maternal experiences simply visible. I think that will be ongoing in continual cycles of new parenthood. But perhaps like with our society at large in recent years, there's an increasing recognition of the impact of systems. So I'll show a few examples of artworks and projects along these lines that we discuss in Inappropriate Bodies. Jill Miller's The Milk Truck addresses the social discomfort around the presence of the lactating body in public and the phenomenon of discrimination that has been particularly pervasive in the US when breastfeeding mothers are asked to leave restaurants, swimming pools, or retail stores. Miller conceived this performance art response to the unfriendly or even hostile environment encountered by mothers who nurse in public. And she employs strategies of humor and absurdity. After raising funds through a Kickstarter campaign, Miller purchased an old ice cream truck and converted it into a breastfeeding support vehicle. She envisioned that she would drive the truck around, offering support to nursing mothers, attending nursing-related events, and responding to breastfeeding emergencies. What became the milk truck is a lactivist mobile art installation and performance, an artist's way of responding to a social issue. The milk truck empowers nursing mothers, creates community, raises awareness, and as a truck topped by a huge breast with a flashing nipple is definitely a sight to behold. As Miller says in her video, thought the nursing mother created a spectacle, meet the milk truck. In 2016, Diana Gravina piloted the first Mother House in London, a studio for artist mothers with integrated childcare. Gravina identified the lack of affordable childcare, as well as lack of studio space, as key reasons why artist mothers give up making work during the early childhood years. The Mother House offered a collaborative, playful, productive environment for both artists and children. Like a gym membership, artists pay a monthly fee for studio and childcare, but on a sliding scale, so they only pay what they can afford. Gravina stresses the importance of a new institutional model. She says, I understood very quickly that I couldn't be a lone voice, that the collective would make a difference, because creating a new model of institution would help me reach other institutions that recognize institutional work, but don't give space and voice to someone working alone. During the first 6 months of the pilot, nearly 40 artists participated, and she's since built a business model that she's been able to replicate in other locations. Prams in the Hall is another UK-based initiative, a group of performance-based artist parents in London. They take their name from a 1938 book by Cyril Connolly called Enemies of Promise, in which he wrote, quote, there is no more somber enemy of good art than the pram in the hall. I'll just say that again to make sure you get that. There is no more somber enemy of good art than the pram in the hall. So basically, women and children stay home. Prams in the Hall embraces Connolly's words precisely in order to subvert them, and they've set about restructuring their practice to include rehearsals and performances where children are welcomed and even incorporated as creative additions to the process. Another project by Martina Molani, Enemies of Good Art, also draws in its name specifically on Connolly's derogatory words. Molani developed the Enemies of Good Art radio show, a bit of a podcast precursor, through which she tried to reach out, find, and build community. But she also did this work in person, intervening in museum spaces, bringing the prams into the hall literally. She organized a series of meetups for artist mothers and their children, held in museum and gallery spaces. In a very practical, subtle, yet subversive way, she drew attention to the unwelcome reception felt by many artist mothers and discussed the issue within those same art institutions, while also normalizing the presence of mothers and children in those spaces. This recurring thread of building community is vital for artist parents figuring out how to make it work, and it takes many forms. In 2016, Rushika Wasan-Zing launched an initiative in India, the Archive for Mapping Maternal Artists in Asia. In my interview with her for the Inappropriate Bodies book, Rushika expressed that her feelings of isolation as an artist mother and the lack of scholarship or even interest on the topic in her country were primary reasons for starting this project. She frames her archive in terms of mapping, visibility, and mobility. Mapping is the database, profiles of artist mothers in India and other parts of Asia. Visibility extends into workshops, exhibitions, and forums where the artist mother and her work can participate in larger conversations. And mobility is about designing a short-term artist residency that welcomes parents and artists and offers a format that works with their family situations. Krista Donner is the founder of Cultural Reproducers, an organization of artist parents devoted to making the art world a more inclusive place. Cultural Reproducers is a website and creative platform, features interviews, write-ups of family-friendly artist residencies, and a listing of resources, books, articles, other websites, anything that might help a cultural reproducer find her way. But rather than assuming that each artist parent should figure it out on her own, Krista continually works to question the systems in place. In 2014, she and her colleague Selena Trepp worked with museums in Chicago to host a series of childcare supported events and to bring attention to museum practices that they might not even realize are exclusionary. As a concrete example, they helped museums re-envision exhibition openings to be more accessible. Rather than hosting an opening in the evening, a difficult, if not impossible, time for parents of young children to attend, some Chicago museums tried out Saturday morning openings, thanks to their intervention. They also hosted a series of what they called Making It What We Need workshops for parent artists. These dreaming and brainstorming sessions helped parents articulate constraints to their artistic practice and possible concrete steps to overcoming these barriers. And it's this idea of making it what we need that I think really frames so much of what interests me right now, where artist parents are designing for change. So this work is a good transition point at which to talk about an early stage collaboration that I'm engaging with with artist and professor Maria Velasco, co-curating an exhibition called Making It Work, Art Plus Parenting. In this exhibition, which will open in just over a year, summer 2022, at the Lawrence Art Center in Lawrence, Kansas, we're not so interested in showing just representations of parents and children. We're much more drawn to, for one thing, artists who embrace the generative possibilities of parenthood, which might be through subject matter or collaboration or new rhythms and processes prompted by this shift in identity. And secondly, artists who employ their roles as caregivers as a lens through which to consider institutional structures, political reform, activism, or more sustainable futures. We developed our initial ideas pre-pandemic, but of course we anticipate that the impacts of the pandemic itself, particularly the additional constraints on parents, may show up in the work as well. So in the last bit of my time here, I'll talk just a bit about a few of the artists we've invited to participate in the exhibition. One of the reasons we invited Wendy Redstar into the project is because of her past collaborations with her daughter, Beatrice Redstar Fletcher. For the exhibition, Wendy will be exhibiting photographs from her Absoluca Feminist series, in which she photographs herself and her daughter in colorful Indigenous clothing with bright patterned backgrounds. I think these color choices are implicitly or maybe explicitly in opposition to those historical black and white somber photographs, 19th century photographs of Indigenous women that you may recall from photographers like Edward Curtis. Another part of their collaboration has been that when Wendy has worked on project with some museums, Beatrice has participated by conducting exhibition tours. And we were really interested in this practice of centering a young Indigenous voice as an authority in the museum space. But Beatrice is now a teenager, and Wendy told us that she has since retired from their collaboration. Lisa Haller-Baggeson is a Danish-born artist-mother activist who creates large fabric installations that create inviting, interactive spaces for viewer participation. As a grad student several years ago, Lisa developed the concept of modernism, which became the focus of her MFA thesis and subsequent book. Modernism, as a term, represents Lisa's project to locate the mother-shaped hole in the art world as she experienced it in graduate school and beyond. And of course, it's a play on the many isms of art history: modernism, expressionism, Why not modernism? While Lisa argues for a maternal viewpoint as a political position, staking a maternal claim within contemporary art spaces is a joyous activism with fabric flags and disco balls. Some of her past installations have included hammocks and reading rooms for viewers. For our exhibition, she'll be adapting the modernism installation to a front window-facing gallery, hoping to bring in some outside in. Chicago artist Alberto Aguilar was one of the first artists Maria and I thought of when we began our brainstorming. He has a long history of working collaboratively with his family, often in very site-specific ways. Although looking at some of his work initially, especially his sculptural work, you might see little that represents the role of an artist parent. But rather than literal representation, his photographs, his installations, his time-based works represent the dynamics between family members and as individuals and as members of the larger unit. We're hoping to fund Aguilar and his family to come to Lawrence, not only to make new work on site, but to have the presence of the family in the space as intimately tied to the work itself. When we did a Zoom studio visit, he talked a good deal about the points of transition now that his children are nearly all adults. And for Maria and me too, that feels like an important point to include. A recognition that the stages of parenting, that while addressing the intensive needs of the early childhood years might feel imperative, it's no less important to recognize the long-term impacts of relationships within a family and how those can continue to inform artistic work. Gina Valentine is an artist whose recent work is heavily text-based. Explication de texte, for example, is an edition of a newspaper from 2015 in which she manipulates text from media reporting on the deaths of young Black men from police violence as a way to try to make sense of the news, as well as to forge some kind of an understanding of this unimaginable maternal loss. Since 2005, she's also been involved in an ongoing collaboration, the Black Lunch Table, a physical and virtual project that involves knowledge sharing across generations, oral histories, as well as activist initiatives like Wikipedia editathons, filling the knowledge gaps on Black artists and creating accessible archives for these histories. And finally, Holly Wilson is another artist we'll include, an artist based in Oklahoma whose work deals with Indigenous identity, legacy, and storytelling as a way to maintain and transmit knowledge. Her installations often incorporate images of women and children as vehicles for storytelling, connecting to Indigenous identity and kinship. She refers to her own mother as a storyteller of traditions, passing on stories of the Delaware and Cherokee in ways that now inform some of the specific symbols that show up in her art. In much of her work, maternal bodies and maternal experiences are profoundly tied to a cultural and intergenerational sharing of knowledge. There are so many ways to explore how one's parenting position can impact and inform one's art making. Some, as you see, clearly embrace generative possibilities that parenthood might offer to one's role as artist through collaboration, or a means by which to explore and draw attention to ethnic or cultural heritages, or as simply a different way of seeing the world. Others find themselves drawn to activism, or consider the maternal as a political orientation, or see it as motivation to change the systems around us. And there is still work to be done as it pertains to visibility, to a diversity of maternal bodies and maternal experiences in contemporary art. Of course, the overview I've given is not comprehensive. The list by now is simply too long, and there are many others whose work I could have included. What I hope to have shown, though, is how contemporary artists have so greatly expanded the ways in which the idea of mother is represented in visual culture. We've moved far beyond the fairly narrow construction of ideal motherhood, represented for centuries by Mother Mary. By addressing mothering in terms of differences of geography, race, ethnicity, social class, sexual identity, religion, or politics, and by intervening in or moving outside of the gallery space, contemporary artists speak to the complexities of mothering. They make visible that there is not one singular experience of maternity, not one road, but many. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was so wonderful and informative. And I think I speak for everyone here when I say that. For anyone who wants to know more about her work, you can find her on Instagram at RachelEppBuller74 and on Facebook as well. You can search Reconciling Art and Mothering there, find her there. As we leave, I want to offer one quick plug for an event we have coming up next week. The museum will be screening Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust on Monday, May 3rd at 6 p.m. There will be a panel discussion afterwards, so we'd love to see you there. And with that, thank you again, Rachel, for speaking tonight, and to everyone in the audience for spending the evening with us. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.